On Monday morning, June 14th at exactly 10:42 a.m., I found a white envelope sitting in the middle of my dining table, a place I never leave mail. The label was printed, not handwritten, as if I were a client rather than a mother. Financial alignment agreement, Margaret Allen, signature required. The air in the room felt still, as if even the refrigerator hum softened while I opened it. Inside was a contract already signed by my daughter Lily and her husband Connor Hale. Their signatures were smooth, confident, and dated 3 days earlier. They hadn't asked for my consent. They hadn't waited for my approval. They had simply written my future for me. My eyes caught on one line, a number so wrong it made my fingers go numb. Transfer of parental assets into Hale Family Trust, $190,000, initial contribution. Not requested, not proposed, claimed, as if I were an account to be emptied, not a person they loved. And in that quiet kitchen, with the late morning sun warming the envelope, one question rose through me like a cold tide. How could they do this to me? If this moment stirs something familiar in you, stay with me. What comes next is the truth I carried in silence for far too long. I am Margaret Allen, a 61-year-old widow who learned early that stability is built one careful choice at a time. My life has never been extraordinary, but it has been intentional. For 30 years I worked as an accountant, the kind who never missed a reconciliation or misplaced a decimal. That precision kept a roof over our heads after my husband died, and it carried Lily through every milestone she dreamed of. I paid for her college tuition semester by semester, her first used Honda that I negotiated down by $2,000, her wedding venue when she cried about budget, even the seed money for her first business, the one that folded after 8 months but taught her how to get back up. Through all of it, I never kept score. I simply believe that a mother's support, when given with open hands, becomes a foundation her child walks on. I thought Lily knew that. Lily has always had a soft heart, almost too soft at times. She saw goodness everywhere, even in people who showed their teeth more than their intentions. When she met Connor, she told me his confidence made her feel protected. I remember watching him charm the server during our first dinner together, speaking with that polished smoothness of a man who was always performing. His smile reached his eyes, but only enough to pass as warm. Underneath, something in him stayed calculating, as if he were cataloging the weaknesses of everyone at the table. Still, Lily loved him. And I truly tried to see what she saw. I told myself that charm and polish were not crimes. I told myself that maybe I was being too cautious, too observant, too shaped by years of guarding every financial boundary alone. But over time, Connor and Lily began leaning on me for things that weren't small. A short-term loan here, a wedding upgrade there, then help covering the rent during the months his consulting work slowed. They spoke about it as if it were natural, as if my resources were an extension of theirs simply because we shared a last name at the wedding. And though I kept giving, I also kept noticing. Their dependency wasn't accidental. It was turning into expectation. They relied on me for everything, and somehow believed that reliance was evidence that they deserved even more. Not gratitude. Not partnership. Access. Looking back now, I can see it clearly. They had begun to think of my stability as their inheritance long before I was ready to hand anything over. I held these memories quietly, the way one holds a familiar photograph, aware of the edges, aware of the weight, and aware that some truths only reveal themselves in hindsight. A week before Lily's wedding, I stood in her small apartment kitchen, helping her fold pale blue napkins the venue required us to bring. She was humming, distracted, her movements lighter than usual. When she suddenly laughed, too quickly, too tightly, I felt the shift before she spoke. Connor thinks your financial habits are outdated, she said, eyes fixed on the napkin in her hands. I remember pausing, the fabric still warm from the iron. Outdated. The word landed softly, but its meaning scraped. I chose not to respond then. I didn't want to ruin the afternoon. I told myself Lily was simply repeating something thoughtless, something thrown into the air during a conversation I hadn't been part of. I believed she hadn't meant to wound me. But when I lifted my head, I caught Connor's expression from across the room. He wasn't looking at the decorations or the seating chart. They were discussing those just minutes earlier. He was looking at me the way someone appraises a property, noting its strengths, weaknesses, potential yield. His eyes flicked between the envelopes stacked on the counter, deposit receipts, rental confirmations, invoices I had paid, and then returned to me with a quiet decision already forming. It lasted only a second, but the calculation was unmistakable. Still, I brushed it off. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was tired, that weddings made everyone say foolish things. I folded another napkin, smoothing its corners as though steady hands could steady the moment. But small comments continued. When I offered to cover the floral delivery fee, Connor said, "Well, that'll help ease your load." My load. As if my life were a burden he would soon be managing. When Lily mentioned I'd kept every financial document since her childhood, he chuckled and said, "Some habits die hard." None of it was overt. Nothing I could confront. But the tone had changed, subtle, dismissive, quietly territorial. One evening I arrived early to help them organize the guests' favors. The door was slightly ajar. I heard Connor say, "Once things are aligned, she'll relax. She just needs guidance." Guidance. As if I were a wayward child requiring supervision. That, I realize now, was the first crack. The first small fracture in the trust one had built across decades. At the time, though, I pretended not to hear. I stepped inside, smiled, and pretended the air wasn't suddenly colder. I remember telling myself that families often stumble before they find their footing, that small discomforts were not enough to question someone's character. But even then, something in me had already begun keeping a quiet ledger, noting the tone, the glances, the subtle shifts that would later reveal their full meaning. After the wedding, the shift arrived quietly, like a draft through a window I thought I had closed. It began with tone, small inflections that didn't sound like Lily at all. She repeated Connor's phrases with a softness that made them feel rehearsed, as if she were borrowing someone else's certainty. "We've decided it's time for you to contribute," Connor told me the first Sunday they came for dinner. He said it while straightening his cuff, not even lifting his eyes from the watch he admired a little too often. Lily added, "Mom, it's normal to combine resources." Her voice light, but her fingers restlessly smoothing the hem of her sweater. Their wording hung in the room between us. "We've decided. Combine resources." Phrases that belonged in a boardroom, not in my dining room where Lily used to sit cross-legged as a child, swinging her feet while telling me about school. Now she sat straighter, as if waiting for my compliance. I tried to hold on to the warmth we once had, but each visit carried another quiet pressure. Connor began referring to their apartment expenses as family obligations. He asked about my accounts with polite curiosity that brushed the edges of insistence. He noticed details, statements on my desk, the lockbox key I kept on a small hook by the pantry, the password notebook tucked into the drawer beneath the phone charger. His questions arrived casually, but always with intent. Lily mirrored him without realizing it. "Mom, don't you want to support our future?" she asked one evening, her voice trembling with a guilt she had not earned. She seemed caught between us, absorbing his ambitions and my unease. Small insults slipped into conversations, gentle, nearly invisible. Connor laughed when I mentioned balancing my accounts by hand. "You're still doing that," he said, as though precision were a flaw. When I shared that I'd chosen not to remarry because financial independence mattered to me, he replied, "Everyone needs oversight at some point." Oversight. As though I were a risk he planned to manage. The house, once my sanctuary, began to feel observed. During visits he opened cabinets looking for serving dishes without asking, walked into my home office to check the Wi-Fi, glanced at the framed statements on the corkboard above my desk. He smiled through all of it, but the smile never reached sincerity. Then came the day a new folder appeared in my office. A red one. Not mine. I found it sitting neatly beside my tax files, labeled in Connor's handwriting. Household Integration Plan. Inside were pages of budget projections, my budget projections, based on numbers I had not shared, assumptions I had not approved, and obligations I had never agreed to carry. It wasn't confrontation. It wasn't even a request. It was presence. Encroachment. A quiet rewriting of the boundaries I had spent a lifetime establishing. With each passing week, I felt less like a mother they visited and more like an asset they were preparing to absorb. My voice, once welcomed, now seemed to take up space they believed belonged to them. I kept my reactions mild, measured. But inside, something steady and old began bracing itself, Like a beam tightening before a storm it already senses coming. I reminded myself daily that unease is its own form of evidence, even when nothing has yet broken on the surface. The contract they placed on my dining table wasn't simply bold. It was a declaration. Not of partnership, not of concern, but of ownership. I read the first page 3 times before my eyes could move beyond the heading. The language was clinical, drafted with purpose, structured to erase any trace of my autonomy. It spelled out obligations I had never agreed to and commitments I had never spoken aloud. The line that froze me was simple, almost elegant in its cruelty. Initial transfer amount, $190,000. The account number printed beside it belonged to my old savings account, the one I had opened decades ago when Lily was still learning to walk. It was an account I rarely touched, but one Lily had known about in passing. Only someone with her access could have revealed it. My breath caught when I realized what that meant. She had shared it. She had given him the knowledge he needed to reach for something that was never his. I slept poorly that night, waking in intervals, the envelope still on the kitchen counter as though watching me. At dawn, with the sun barely touching the windowsill, the doorbell rang. The tone was sharp, official, and carried none of the hesitation family uses. At exactly 7:58 a.m., a man in a navy suit stood on my porch holding a leather briefcase. His voice was smooth in the way only professionals learn to craft. "Good morning, Ms. Allen," he said. "I'm here on behalf of the Hale family with an addendum requiring acknowledgement." He handed me a second document. Emergency financial addendum. The pages smelled faintly of toner, still warm from printing. My eyes slid down the text until they stopped at a familiar signature. Lily's. Slanted, hurried, and placed beside a date only hours old. My blood felt cold in a way I hadn't experienced since becoming a widow. There was no misunderstanding here. No moment to explain away. This wasn't an error or oversight. It was coordinated. Intentional. A strategy executed behind my back with precision. The man waited for my signature. I didn't offer one. Instead, I closed the door gently, the paper still in my hand, and felt something inside me shift. Something solid and long ignored rising to the surface. I walked to my living room, sat down slowly, and placed both contracts on the coffee table. Their edges aligned almost perfectly, sharp and accusatory. I traced the signatures with the tip of my finger, marveling at how familiar handwriting could become foreign in an instant. It wasn't the agreements themselves that hurt the most. It was the certainty with which they believed I would comply. In that quiet morning light, I understood the truth I had been resisting. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a choice they had made together, a door they had closed between us without hesitation. I sat with that knowledge, letting its weight settle, knowing the moment marked a boundary I could no longer ignore. I sat in my living room holding both contracts, one in each hand, their weight far heavier than paper should ever feel. The morning light slipped through the blinds in thin, deliberate lines, striping the documents as though the room itself were measuring them. I placed them on the coffee table gently, not out of respect, but because my hands had begun to tremble in a way they hadn't since the first months after my husband's passing. I stared at the signatures, Lily's beautiful looping script beside Connor's practiced, angular strokes. Together they looked coordinated, almost synchronized. It struck me then how little hesitation there was in their writing. No hesitation, no doubt, no pause. Only certainty. I leaned back against the sofa, letting the familiar cushion rise behind my shoulders. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a sound I'd grown so used to that it usually blended into silence. But that morning it felt louder, steadier, almost grounding. A reminder that some things still worked the way they were meant to. For a long moment I simply breathed. I allowed the truth to settle without rushing past it. There was no miscommunication. No confusion to clarify. No conversation that could undo what had been set into motion behind my back. This was not Lily being forgetful or overwhelmed. This was not Connor misunderstanding my boundaries. This was a coordinated action, steps taken without me, for a future that did not include my consent. I reached for the drawer of my end table and opened it slowly. Inside lay a small collection of things I kept within arm's reach. A lavender candle, a stack of old photographs, a silver pen, and beneath them all, a thin folder containing my own documents. Bank summaries I reviewed monthly. My will. A few notes I'd written to myself during the years I learned to live alone. I slid the drawer shut, but not before pausing, my fingers resting on its edge. That motion felt symbolic in a way I didn't fully understand until the moment completed. I wasn't just closing a drawer. I was closing access. Closing the assumption they had built their plans upon. Closing a chapter one had allowed to continue too long out of love and habit. As the latch clicked, something in me aligned with the sound. A quiet steadiness. A decision forming not in anger but in clarity. I stood, walked to the kitchen, filled my old ceramic mug, the one with the fading blue pattern, and held it between my hands, letting the warmth settle into my palms. While the tea steeped, I thought of Lily as a child, sitting at this same table with construction paper and glitter, making cards that said, "Mom, you're my hero." I remembered the softness in her voice when she'd hug me after school, the easy trust in her eyes. I held those memories gently, knowing they were real, even if the present version of her had drifted far from the child who once made promises with crayon certainty. But memories could not excuse choices, and love could not override truth. By the time I finished my tea, the realization was no longer a shock, it was a fact. A quiet, painful fact, but one that carried its own kind of strength. This would not continue. Not like this. Not with silence mistaken for permission. I placed the mug in the sink, wiped the counter with a slow, deliberate motion, and felt the tension in my chest settle into resolve. The decision had already been made. I had simply needed a moment to hear it clearly inside myself. I stood there for a long breath, understanding that clarity is its own form of protection, and I would honor it from this moment forward. The morning after I closed the drawer on those contracts, I woke with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. It was not joy and not anger, but something quieter and more durable, a kind of internal alignment. I made coffee, sat at the dining table opposite the white envelope, and knew that doing nothing would be its own kind of consent. That was the one thing I could no longer offer. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't used in months. James Porter, my attorney. He had helped me once with updating my will after my husband passed, and I remembered his patience, the way he explained each clause without condescension. When he answered, his voice was the same. Steady, measured, present. "James," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. "We need a plan. A real one." He didn't rush me. "Tell me what happened," he said. I walked him through everything. The unauthorized contracts. The lawyer on my porch. The use of my old savings account. I gave him dates, amounts, phrases word for word where I could recall them. Habit made me precise. Pain made me clear. James listened in silence, only the faint scratch of his pen revealing that he was already translating my story into steps. When I finished, there was a pause. Then he said, "All right, Margaret. We're not going to react. We're going to respond." Together we designed a strategy that was quiet, firm, and entirely within the law. James proposed preparing a simplified financial summary, real but limited. It would show that after settling the remainder of my late husband's debts, the only liquid asset I had was the very account Connor had already discovered. One account. One figure. One tempting, contained target. "If he's pushing for access," James said, "this will show you just how far he's willing to go. The rest of my estate, the investments, the property interests, and the trust my husband and I had established years earlier, would remain protected in a structure Connor knew nothing about. The trust, already in Lily's name, was left untouched. She would still inherit what we had built, but not as a conduit for someone else's ambition. Not as leverage." By evening, James had drafted the summary and emailed it to me with a short note. "Use as discussed." I printed it on my old home printer in the office. The paper emerged slowly, the numbers crisp and small, deceptively ordinary. I held it in my hands for a long moment, feeling how something so simple could carry such deliberate purpose. The next morning, I opened the top drawer of my desk, the one Connor had glanced at too often, and placed the summary neatly on top. No lock, no concealment. Just a quiet, visible document waiting for the kind of person who went looking for what was not his. As I slid the drawer closed, I noticed my reflection in the glass of the framed photograph above the desk. It was a picture of Lily and me at her college graduation, both of us squinting into the sun, her arm wrapped around my shoulders. I met my own gaze in that reflection and felt something resolute settle there. My hands did not shake. My breathing stayed even. For the first time since Connor entered our lives, I was no longer simply reacting to his moves. I had taken one of my own. Whatever he chose to do next would reveal him completely. And whatever that revealed, I was finally ready to face. I carried that calm with me through the day, knowing that preparation is a quiet kind of power, and I was no longer willing to live unprepared. I carried that calm with me through the day, knowing that preparation is a quiet kind of power, and I was no longer willing to live unprepared. I carried that calm with me through the day, knowing that preparation is a quiet kind of power, and I was no longer willing to live unprepared. 3 days passed before anything happened. On the surface, my life looked ordinary. Tea at 7, a short walk through the garden, a chapter of a book before bed. But underneath, a thin wire of anticipation ran through each hour. I didn't hover over my phone or refresh my email obsessively. I simply waited, letting the plan we'd set in motion do its work. The call came on a Thursday morning. My bank's fraud department left a polite but urgent voicemail asking me to verify a large and unusual transaction. I dialed back, my notebook open on the table, pen ready as if I were back in my office years ago, documenting a discrepancy. A woman named Carla answered. Her tone was professional, a little cautious. Ms. Allen, we flagged an attempted transfer of $190,000 from your savings account ending in 0342. We need to confirm whether you authorized this. No, I said. I did not. She went on to describe the attempt. 2 devices had been used within minutes of each other. One matched the login pattern of Lily's tablet. The other matched a newer device recently added to the profile, a laptop under Connor's credentials. They had not just stumbled into temptation, they had coordinated. As Carla spoke, I felt no panic, just a deep, settling clarity. The test had worked. We locked the account, documented the attempt, and arranged for written confirmation. When I hung up, I looked toward my office, toward the drawer where the decoy summary had been placed. The boundary I had drawn had just been tested and breached. That afternoon, I sent a message to Lily. I'd like to have you and Connor over for lunch. I think we should talk. I chose my words carefully. No accusation. No hint of conflict. Just an open door that had, quietly, already changed its hinges. She replied almost immediately. Of course, Mom. We'll be there. On the day of the lunch, I roasted chicken with rosemary and lemon, the familiar scent wrapping the house in something comforting. I set the table with the good plates, small acts of normalcy to steady myself. When the doorbell rang, Lily stepped in first, her smile a little tight at the edges. Connor followed, confident as ever, his eyes making a quick sweep of the room the way they always did, as though assessing what might be useful. We began with small talk. Work. Weather. Courses Lily was considering taking. The food kept our hands busy while the real conversation waited just beyond reach. When the plates were half finished, I spoke. The bank called me this morning, I said mildly. There was an attempt to move a large amount from my savings. I watched the words land. Lily's fork paused midway to her mouth. Connor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I thought we had agreed on aligning everything, he said a little too quickly. This must be a misunderstanding with the bank systems. They're paranoid about older accounts. Older accounts. Older habits. Older women. I didn't argue. Instead, I reached for my phone, opened a message from Carla, and placed it on the table so they could see the screen. 2 device IDs. 2 timestamps. 1 failed transfer. I let the silence do what explanations could not. Then came the final confirmation. James, who had gone through the wedding footage I had sent him, discovered a clip of Connor at the reception bar. In it, he stood surrounded by friends, jacket loosened, drink in hand. The music was loud, but one line rose clearly above it. Give me a month, he said, laughing. I'll unlock her mom's vault. I pressed play and set the phone between us. Lily's face drained of color as she listened. Her hand slipped from her fork to the table, fingers curling slightly as if trying to hold onto something solid. Connor started to protest, stumbling over explanations about jokes and figures of speech, but the words sounded thin, even to him. Trust does not shatter with a scream. Sometimes it breaks in a single quiet moment when disbelief finally has nowhere left to stand. I carried that calm with me through the day, knowing that preparation is a quiet kind of power, and I was no longer willing to live unprepared. I carried that calm with me through the day, knowing that preparation is a quiet kind of power, and I was no longer willing to live unprepared. I carried that calm with me through the day, knowing that preparation is a quiet kind of power, and I was no longer willing to live unprepared. I carried that calm with me through the day, knowing that preparation is a quiet kind of power, and I was no longer willing to live unprepared. After the confrontation, the house felt strangely hollow, as though every room were relearning how to hold silence. Connor left in a rush, his steps sharp and indignant, but his anger barely registered. What stayed with me was the look on Lily's face, quiet, stunned, as if she were seeing the shape of her life for the first time without his explanation softening the edges. She sat at my table long after he was gone. I didn't touch her shoulder or urge her to speak. Sometimes the heart needs stillness to understand its own fracture. When she finally whispered, "Mom, I didn't know." The words trembled with recognition rather than apology. There are truths that arrive gently but cut deeply all the same. The next morning the world around me seemed to settle back into itself. The hum of the refrigerator returned to its familiar rhythm, the wooden stairs sighed under my steps, and the scent of lemon soap from the night before lingered faintly on my hands. I felt myself re-inhabiting my life, as though a long-held breath had finally eased out of my chest. Connor tried once to reach out, an insistent email, a thinly veiled attempt to regain ground, but James intercepted, handling each detail with quiet precision. With the evidence laid bare, Connor had no room left to maneuver. His confidence dissolved when charm no longer worked, and legal language replaced easy promises. The annulment papers were signed soon after. No claims, no negotiations, no foothold left for him to stand on. When Lily came to tell me, she stood on my porch wrapped in the same gray sweater she used to wear during late-night study sessions in college. Her eyes were tired, but clearer than I had seen in years. "I'm starting over," she said, her voice steady. "I want to rebuild myself." I stepped aside to let her in but gently added, "You're welcome here, but your life is yours." She nodded with understanding. Not dependence, not guilt, but a quiet acceptance of responsibility. It was the first sign she was finding her way back to herself. In the following weeks, the house that had once felt too large grew heavier with memories I no longer wished to carry. I made the decision to sell it. Some goodbyes are not painful, only necessary. The day I signed the final papers, I walked through each room one last time. The echo of my steps felt like closure. My new home near the river in Charleston was smaller, but it breathed easier. The first morning there, I planted a young lemon tree in the backyard. Its slender trunk swayed in the warm breeze, fragile but rooted, and I saw in it something of myself. A beginning disguised as something modest. Life adopted a gentler rhythm. I took slow walks along the water, listening to the low rush against the shore, a sound steady enough to quiet even the most lingering worries. The air tasted different, lighter, as though carrying no old expectations. Lily enrolled in psychology courses at the community college. She told me she wanted to understand the patterns she had ignored, the reasons she had trusted a man who cloaked ambition in affection. I told her growth is rarely loud. It is the quiet decision to do better with what we now know. Our relationship began to soften not because we avoided the past, but because we no longer lived inside it. She visited on weekends, bringing small updates about her classes, her new routines, the way she felt herself changing. Each time she left, I felt a small, steady gratitude. She was healing not through me but beside me. My home became a place shaped by intention rather than obligation. I cooked meals because I wanted to taste something warm at the end of the day. I sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sky shift colors over the river. I learned the weight of my own quiet, and how peaceful it felt when no one tried to take it from me. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was balance. And balance, I learned, is its own kind of freedom. Every day settled a little more gently around me, reminding me that rebuilding a life is not a single choice but a series of quiet, steady ones. In the quiet of my new home, I began to understand something I had missed for years. Protection is not only an act of love, it is an act of self-respect. I had spent so long smoothing conflict, absorbing discomfort, and telling myself that keeping peace was the same as keeping family. But silence, I realized, is its own kind of permission, and I had given it far too generously. Now my days move at a pace that belongs to me. I wake to the sound of the river outside my window and the soft clink of the old mug I still use every morning. I water the lemon tree in the yard, brushing my fingers against its small leaves, and think of how roots deepen quietly without announcement. Feeling is much the same. Sometimes in the late afternoon, I sit at the kitchen table with my ledger open, not because I fear what I will find, but because those numbers are mine again, answerable to no one else. The accounts are orderly, the trust secure, the future clearly written in documents Lily now understands were meant to protect her, not control her. The money remains where it should be. A tool, not a leash. Lily visits often. She brings her textbooks and sits on the couch, highlighting sentences about boundaries, attachment, and the patterns we repeat until we finally see them clearly. We don't revisit every detail of what happened with Connor. We don't need to. His absence speaks more honestly than any explanation he could offer. What matters now is the way she carries herself. More upright, more cautious with her trust, but not closed. One evening after dinner, she looked around my small living room and said, "It feels calm here, Mom." I smiled because I finally felt it too. Calm not because everything is perfect, but because everything inside these walls is honest. I used to believe inheritance was something handed down in numbers and signatures in carefully stored folders. Now I know the real inheritance I offer my daughter is different. It is the example of a woman who chose to step back from the edge of erasure, who refused to let love be used as a doorway to control. It is the quiet proof that you can protect what matters without hardening your heart. I don't feel victorious. I feel whole. There is a difference. If you are listening to this and some part of it echoes in your own life, know this: you are not unreasonable for wanting respect. You are not selfish for asking questions. You are not disloyal for saying enough when your boundaries are treated like open accounts. Wanting safety is not greed. Wanting clarity is not cruelty. These days I close my doors at night, turn off the lights, and let the hush of the river guide me to sleep. I have learned that my life, my voice, and my choices are not assets to be managed. They are mine to own. If this touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength. I carry that lesson with me into every quiet morning and every ordinary evening, knowing that dignity is built in small, steady decisions to stand by yourself. I carry that lesson with me into every quiet morning and every ordinary evening, knowing that dignity is built in small, steady decisions to stand by yourself. I carry that lesson with me into every quiet morning and every ordinary evening, knowing that dignity is built in small, steady decisions to stand by yourself. I carry that lesson with me into every quiet morning and every ordinary evening, knowing that dignity is built in small, steady decisions to stand by yourself.